Okay, this is a lecture on non-consequentialism, which is indicated by the prefix non. It's just basically any moral theory that's not consequentialist. Um, this is an easy presentation to make in the sense that, well, it's literally, if you deny consequentialism, then any theory that denies that is a non-consequentialist theory, but it's also hard because there's actually a cluster of non-consequentialist theories. I'm going to focus on two variants, though, of non-consequentialism today. So briefly, non-consequentialism, for review, holds that some kinds of actions, for example, killing the innocent, are wrong in themselves and not wrong merely because they have bad consequences. It doesn't say all actions are wrong in themselves and not all wrong actions are wrong in themselves and not because they have bad consequences. It just says that it's not the case that for all actions they're wrong because they have bad consequences. Even if there's only one type of thing that's wrong in itself, that's all you need for a non-consequentialist theory. It'd be like saying everything is made out of H2O. Well, if you find one molecule that's not made out of H2O, then the thesis that everything's made out of H2O is false. Well, consequentialism is a theory about all actions. Basically, all actions that are right simply because they have good consequences. So if you have some actions, even if there's just one that are right or wrong, not in virtue of the consequences, but just in themselves or something else, then boom, that's all you need. Okay, so we're going to look at, like I said, two variants of non-consequentialism today. And briefly, actions that are right or wrong in and of themselves, independently of consequences, are divided into two types. One are theories that admit exceptionless rules, and the second is what's called prima facie rules, prima facie rules. I'm just going to pronounce it facie, and I know Latin. So I'll explain what each of those in turn mean. Actually, we're going to start with number two, prima facie rules. So prima facie rules. Some non-consequentialists argue that we have what are called prima facie duties. Prima facie, which is Latin for at first glance, prima facie duties then are duties that hold all things being equal, which is another legal term, ceteris paribus. And we'll unpack that in a second. That is, basically, a prima facie duty can sometimes be overridden by other factors. So they're not exceptionless, so they hold, but on occasions they can be overridden by other considerations. For example, all things being equal, we have a prima facie duty to keep our promises. Keeping promises matters not because of the consequences, but because of the kind of act promise making is. It's basically when you make a promise, you create an obligation for yourself to keep that promise. But not just promise keeping, we could generalize this to a lot of different types of duties. So generalizing, the basic moral principles in this approach are about prima facie duties, therefore all things being equal, we should keep our promises, not harm others, we should treat others equally, and so on. And what matters is the kind of thing we do, not just the consequences of what we do, and that's important. I want to say that again. The thing about prima facie duties in the thing about a non-consequentialist ethical theory that says there are prima facie duties is that these duties get their moral status, they're obligatory. Not in terms of the consequences, but in terms of just the type of thing they are. So making a promise gives you an obligation to keep that promise, not because of the consequences of not keeping the promise, but because just of the type of thing you've just done. You've made a promise, therefore you've created this obligation. But a non-consequentialist who believes there are prima facie duties will admit occasionally duties conflict. So if you recall, rule of thumb utilitarianism is supposed to solve for when duties conflict. They have a solution to that. So for example, you promise to hang out with your boyfriend or girlfriend after class, but then after class you discover that your mother is violently ill. She's a zombie. So while your mother urgently needs medical care, you've made a promise. So helping your mother out would require you breaking your promise. Oh no. Oh yes. The prima facie, and by the way, I think most people would say, duh, break the promise and help your mother out. But the question is, what moral framework can give justification for that? We saw what utilitarianism has to offer. Well, can a non-utilitarian and non-consequentialist theory also accommodate this? And they will say, yes, the prima facie duty of you can accommodate this. You can. In fact, you ought to break the promise and not do the wrong thing. So the question is, how? Well, for starters, the prima facie worldview is not an exceptionless worldview. Remember, from the outset, it doesn't hold that there are duties that hold exceptionlessly. They hold all things considered, all things being equal. There can be overriding factors. That's just built into it, this notion of prima facie duties. So, in fact, the prima facie worldview rejects exceptionless rules for the same reasons that the utilitarian does. So remember, it can result in contradictory or conflicting duties. It can lead to inhumane results, the Dr. Evil problem. However, there is an important difference between the prima facie worldview and the utilitarian. Because the utilitarian is going to say it's okay to break a promise or some other, not keep with some other prima facie duty if breaking that promise has just even slightly better consequences. So your boss could skip out on paying you, even though he's promised to pay you, if he he's going to give that money to the poor instead. Now, the utilitarian is committed to, well, then the boss should give the money to the poor, even though you've worked for that money and the boss has promised to pay you. The prima facie rule defender is going to think they have a better answer to that. They're going to challenge that for one thing. They're going to say your boss should keep his promise because he made a promise, and by promising you, he's created an obligation to keep his promise. Regardless of the consequences, it's just the very nature of promising means that he's got to keep it. And the utilitarian view then will result, if followed, in people not taking promises that seriously. If you could find some rationale to break it, then, people do it all the time. Still, this question looms. We now understand the prima facie worldview's criticism of utilitarianism's solution to the problem of exceptionless rules, but what do they offer? Do they have a principled account to explain how we can get around conflicts, how we can explain how some duties can be overridden? We're going to get to that. One more point, though. Well, a few more points. Just for simplicity's sake, we're looking at what you read was the views of W.D. Ross, who's a well-known defender of non-consequentialism, and he introduced the notion of prima facie duties, and he listed 7 basic prima facie duties. Fidelity, which is basically keeping your promises. Reparations, making up for any harm you've done. Gratitude, returning good to those who have done good to you. Justice, which he says, which is a bit murky, is upsetting distributions of pleasure or happiness that don't accord with merit. And beneficence, doing good to others, and non-maleficence, don't harm others. Which I say, don't be an ass. Okay, going back to this conflict then. What do you do when there's a conflict, such as helping your mother or keeping a promise you made to your boyfriend or girlfriend? According to Ross, the stronger duty should always be followed. So in this case, we'd say that the stronger duty is the duty to help your mother, beneficence. Okay? But does Ross offer a systematic, coherent way to determine which duty is stronger? After all, the utilitarian does have an easy answer. The duty when followed, would have better consequences. They have a systematic, coherent way to explain which duty ought to be followed. Does Ross offer a way? Well, he has an answer. He says, intuition. When duties conflict, appeal to your intuitions about which duty is stronger. So, for example, I bet most of you would have a stronger intuition that you should help out your mother than keep your promise to your boyfriend or girlfriend when your mother is seriously ill. So, when you come up with this conflict between helping your mother or keeping a promise, your intuition says, help your mother. Therefore, you should help your mother. That's Ross's account. That's his answer. So, it's not the utilitarian answer, but it's a way to deal with conflicts between duties. And I'm going to note right now, that's the weakest part of Ross's view, because intuitions conflict. So, my intuition might be to keep the promise, while yours is to help your mother, or vice versa. And we can think of numerous other cases where people have different intuitions about what we ought to do. Intuitions just don't seem stable enough, or strong enough, or potent enough, or irrational enough to mediate moral conflicts. Well, so much for Ross's view then. Let's look at the exceptionless norm view then. So maybe that's a bit stronger than we've presented it so far. We made it kind of the boogeyman, and we've kind of beat up on it, but maybe that's actually got more punch to it than we thought. So recall 3 problems with exceptionless norms. 1, they conflict and lead to contradictions. 2, they lead to inhumane results. And 3, the Dr. Evil scenario. Alright. Gensler, who you've been reading, challenges the first point. Take 3, imperatives that we could take to be exceptionless. 1, never kill an innocent person. 2, never take heroin for fun. 3, never commit adultery. Gensler asks, do these norms really conflict? No, they're not contradictory. They don't conflict. So it's not the case in that having an exceptionalist norm view necessarily leads to contradictions or conflicts. It just depends on what those norms are. And we can think of plenty of norms that would be exceptionalist that would never conflict, like the ones above. Well, what about the challenge of inhumane results? So, for example, telling the truth to a Nazi when you've got Jewish persons in your attic. Or I can think of other scenarios. Killing innocent people to relieve 1 million people of an itch. Whatever. Gensler responds that, well, you should avoid. A norm that has inhumane results shouldn't be an exceptionalist norm. So we'll just, our exceptionalist norms won't be the ones that have inhumane results. Problem solved. There's nothing about exceptionalist norms in and of themselves that requires that they have inhumane results. I think that's actually a good answer. In fact, Gensler takes it further. He says, the most plausible exceptionalist norms are the norms that forbid inhumane actions. Okay. This is going to be a brief presentation, and this wasn't in the readings. Well, it's hinted at in the readings, but I want to just talk a little bit about rights real quick. So, deontology, which is something I talked about in the presentation on ethics as a normative theory, which is a non-consequentialist theory, deals with rights. We're going to be talking about rights a lot during this class, so it's important to get clear on how to distinguish different types of rights and the relationship between rights and obligations and rights and morality and rights and legality. So I'm just going to draw some distinctions for these next few slides. This wasn't in the Gensler reading, but this is the best place to talk about it. All right, rights. And actually a lot of this stuff does come from Gensler. So if you believe that there are rights that should never be violated, no matter what the consequences, like the right for the innocent to not be killed, the right to free speech, the right to be free and not be a slave, then you're a non-consequentialist, straight up. If you believe that there are rights that can never be violated, then you are a non-consequentialist. Freedom of religion, for example. I can think of numerous rights. The right to a fair trial. And if you believe that those, you're a non-consequentialist. It's worth stressing that right now. Second point. We got to distinguish then between legal rights and human rights. Legal rights are rights recognized by a governing body of a society. If the legislator decides that we have the right to health care, we have the right to health care. If they vote against it, we don't. Legal rights change based on who's in government, basically. They change throughout time and place. I have a legal right to drive on the right side of the road, and I do not have a legal right to drive on the left-hand side of the road, for example. I have the legal right to vote when I'm 18. Other countries, maybe it's when you're 21. I have the legal right to drink when I'm 21. Other countries, it might be when you're 18. Okay, that's not the same thing as a human right, which is what we would say is a right that you have simply because you're human, regardless of what society you're a member of. It's not the type of thing that can be voted on. A human right isn't. Okay? We would hope legal rights are consistent with human rights, that there's no conflicts. But a lot of times that legal rights changes because we think there is a conflict between legal rights and human rights, so we vote to make the legal rights more correspond better with the human rights. Third point, got to distinguish between negative and positive rights. A negative right is a right to not be interfered with in certain ways, like the right to free speech. A positive right is a right to certain goods that others can provide, like the right to education. Not the same thing. So when you're talking about rights, think, are you talking about a negative or a positive right? Are you talking about a legal or a human right? Another point. This is something that is lost on a lot of people, which is surprising, but it's important. Anytime someone has a right, that entails that someone or some other group of people have an obligation towards the persons that have that right. Rights entail obligations. Let me just illustrate what I mean by that. Suppose I have the negative right to free speech. That entails that other persons have a duty to not suppress my speech. they have a duty to respect that right to free speech. On the flip side, if I have a positive right to education, others have a duty to provide it, the state, the taxpayers, whatever. So, anytime someone has a right, it tells that someone or some other group of persons has an obligation. That's just how it is about rights. So when people insist on certain positive rights like healthcare, they need to admit that they're creating obligations for other people to, like, for example, pay for it and provide it, or for education. Now, I'm not saying that's not a reason. I'm just saying that you don't see this a lot in political discourse. That you can't have one without the other. Okay, and yeah, it just might happen that we do have an obligation to provide healthcare. Okay, great. That entails that other people have a right. All right, last point. Apologize. Well, no, actually I don't. I'm using harsh pictures in this example, and I'm doing that on purpose. Students and journalists and politicians often confuse what is moral with what is legal. And I'm going to stress right now, what is legal is not necessarily moral, and what is moral is not necessarily legal. And here's a vivid example. In the 1800s, in the United States, in the South, it was legal to own slaves, and slave owners could whip slaves, like the picture on the left. Now, we would say that was immoral, grossly immoral. It was wrong for them to do that, even if it was legal. On the flip side, look at this. African Americans at a lunch counter in the South in the 1960s. In the 1960s, it used to be illegal for African Americans to sit at white lunch counters in the South. However, we would definitely not say that it is immoral for African Americans to eat at quote-unquote white lunch counters in the South. It's not the same thing, and we've changed the law to reflect that on both sides. That's the way we'd say we call it progress. The law has progressed. It's gotten closer to what morality actually requires in forbidding the owning of slaves and permitting African Americans to eat at lunch counters. I want to stress that again. Morality and legality are not the same thing. Do not confuse the two. Just because a lot of people do doesn't mean you can. Okay, that is it.